after you've done all of your touch-ups and your color correcting, you may want to do just a little bit of blurring and sharpening to make those images pop out a little bit more or be just even more crisp. So we're going to explore some of the blur and sharpen features or even some new stuff in the CS6 environment. Here we go. Well, when I go to my filter menu, I can see different types of blur options, all kinds of available features. And we're going to start with the field blur. These first three here are all new in CS6, and the other ones have been around for quite a while. But with the field blur, the way it works is I can actually set a point where I want to retain crispness, and I can dial how blurry or how crisp I want this to be. So I want to maintain the crispness of this palm tree here. And when I get in the middle, I can just place it. And I can also go ahead and put another one here on the palm, the branch. And if I need to add more points, I can. Now, as I come out here to the water, I'm going to actually make it more blurry. And you can see how it's blurring that. I can go over here to the sand, make that a little more blurry. And so I'm able to control exactly where I want to have the blur and where I want to maintain some of that crispness just by dialing it a little bit. And at the very top, I can either OK or cancel. Let's go ahead and just do a preview so we can see what it was before and what it is now. And we'll click on OK, and we can see those results. And it's just taking a moment for it to process all that information for us. And now I've got the results based on those blur settings. Go ahead and just undo that step. So that was the field blur, but the iris blur allows you to create a blur where you're actually going to have something that's more of a circle. So if I want to draw attention to a focal point, and I can still make my focal point this tree here, and I'm just going to rotate and size it, and then dial the blurriness to see how much I want to sharpen it or blur it. And then I could put out another area and make it more blurry. And you can see how they overlap. So it's giving me another option, but it's more circular in a way that could work better with these palm trees just because of the length and the shape of it. We'll go ahead and cancel that out. And the other one you have that's new is this tilt shift. And the tilt shift is more geometric or more linear than curved, but you can actually rotate the tilt shift. You can just position it, rotate it, and again, right in the center, I could drag it in and position it. There we go. Got to make sure right on the spot where I can rotate it. There you go. Rotate that. Create my effect. I want to make it blurry or sharp. And as I'm dialing that in, you can see as I'm dialing that in, I'm maintaining this area that's not going to be changed. I can also resize the boundaries and even the blend from sharpness to blur. Just got to make sure I'm on the right spot as I'm resizing. You can see how the handle changes to that double arrow. And how much of that blur is it going to happen once it goes out of that space. I'll just go ahead and choose cancel here as well. But again, what you have are some great blur options that you can use to update your images. But you also have more options with working with blur, with sharpening and blurring and even removing some of the distortions. And so I'm going to come over here to another image, and we're going to explore some different options with blurring and sharpening here. So one option we could do is actually use the blur command just to clean up skin tones, and it could either be filters or with paint brushes. So I have a brush in here that allows me to blur, and I can just get the size of the brush that I want, and I can start blurring, and it's going to smooth this out. This also works great if you have artifacts or some noise and you want to reduce some of that information. You can just use that blur tool. You can also create a selection area around some of that skin tone here, and you can go in and use a filter, and there's some different filters that are available for us. We have the filter that actually blur, so we have these different options, and sometimes instead of blur I'll actually use the sharp feature. There's one here called unsharp mask, which seems like it's going to sharpen it, but actually will blur things for us. And you can kind of move the sliders around. And the way this works is the amount is very subtle. So if you move the amount around, you're not going to see too much of a dramatic, but the radius is pretty dramatic. So if you start moving the radius around, it's telling it what colors it's going to blend. You can start seeing how there's some color shifting here. So I tend to keep my radius pretty small. And the threshold's even more dramatic. So if I move that threshold, now it might depend on the image, but it can also affect sometimes. So I usually keep the threshold pretty small, but it has to do with how much of a color variation there's going to be as well. Anyway, this is what it looked like before. This is what it looks like now, and it's going to smooth this out. Another tool that I like to use when I'm working with skin tones has to do with the render. Actually, where is this? It goes into here to noise, and we have some options called despeckle. And despeckle is a good one when you're trying to remove some, trying to smooth out some skin tones. And it's a little bit more natural, a little more solid. Let's go ahead and undo a few of these steps in here. I'm just going to use my backward command till we get back to the original pixels. In fact, we can just do a revert, F12, and revert that. And we will reselect these areas. Let's take another look at the filters in here. In addition to despeckle, there's also one called dust and scratches. And this is better when it's not necessarily skin tones, but you might have a old photo with some white marks in it or some dust. And this is a good way to clean those up. It blends the backgrounds together. Reduced noise is also really helpful. A lot of those cheaper cameras or smartphones or sometimes when they're scanned in, you get those boxes and they have these artifacts, that kind of a grainy look, and so you can use this to reduce the noise. I'll tell you though that sometimes you're stuck with what you start with your sources, so sometimes you can't really reduce the noises that much, but this does help with that. So those are some different options you can use. Let's choose that despeckle, and you can kind of see before and after how it smooths that out. Another option that you can do to be really dramatic is you can actually make a copy of the image here and then apply a intense blur. I'm going to use this blur here, and we'll go down to the Gaussian blur, and I can scroll a little bit, and I can apply this blur, and that's maybe a little bit too intense. I still want to have some of the detail, but I'm going to be kind of blurring some of those options, right? Let's take a scroll over, and we can see around the eyes too, right? It's kind of an automatic facelift. And if we compare that with the preview versus, you can start seeing a little bit of a change. I'll click on OK. Now, you can see how that's changed. Now, obviously, it's really too blurry because we lost some of the details, the depth of that sky. But we're going to still use this to our advantage. And we're going to go ahead and come here to our snapshot. Take a snapshot of this where it's blurry and make that our history brush. Make that our history state here. And then go back in history to just before we blurred it. So our snapshot is still based on the blurriness, although what we're seeing is the unblurry option. And we'll even go ahead and hide that layer. And what we can do now is get our history brush, And with the history brush, we can take some different modes that will allow us to lighten things up. And so instead of just painting directly on the blur, we can even paint with a slight blending. Let's start with just painting normally. We'll come over here to where her eyes are. And as I'm painting, it's actually painting some of that blur back in because that was based on the history. And I could even go back and lighten that up using either screen or lighten. And as I paint, it's adding, that might be just a little too much, but it's going to add in a little bit of a lighter effect. Oh, there you go. I had to make sure I had that blue highlighted, so I was trying to press my bracket button and had to first escape out of that. Just go ahead and turn that up and kind of blur that. And I could also just use my regular blur tool and make some changes as well and kind of blur those and soften those in as well. In addition to blur, you have the sharpen and the smudge tool. The sharpen you have to be really careful about. You don't want to over sharpen something because it is cumulative and it can start looking like a Christmas tree pretty soon. But it's a way to add details in. So for example, I go back to this one where the eyes are softer, and we could go in and we could sharpen up those images for us, make them more intense, sometimes with the teeth. And a lot of times with faces, if just sharpening those eyes and the teeth really makes them pop out more than what we used to have. And so if we compare that with a revert, it's subtle, but there's a little bit of a difference in her eyes, and we can compare that with before and after. This was with the sharpening and a little bit of the blur to give it a little bit of a boost in there. Let's go ahead and take just one more option. There was the smudge tool. Now the smudge tool isn't going to make it more sharp or blurry, but if you go ahead and click on that smudge tool, it's going to end up like a water paint or like an acrylic. It's going to smudge the areas with each other, and it does have a bit of a blur effect, but we could use that to kind of lighten up or make these lights a little bit more subdued and maybe change them so they're not quite as bright. You could also do some other options, but it's just giving you a chance to create a more stylized effect with that. Okay, well, one more thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to resize this information. And a lot of times what you do is you're taking images, you're going to put them on a website. And if you're going to be doing that, then you're going to have to reduce the resolution quite a bit and the file size, because let's take a look here. View actual pixels. This is the size of the image if we put this right on the website. That's just too big. So we're going to come down and change that. I'm going to use the crop to size and resolution. And I'm going to put in a resolution of 200 pixels as the width, and the resolution is going to be a 72 pixels per inch. Let's go ahead and size that down. And I'm just going to crop out a little bit of the content because we don't need that area in the back. And just do a little bit of cropping there, and we go ahead and OK. Let's take a look at this with our actual pixels. So it's definitely a lot smaller than before, and we can put this on the website. But one of the things that happens is that when you resample down for the web, especially dramatically like this, you lose some of the features in the face. And particularly if you have a face, what you may want to do is go back into the filter and use one of these options where you can sharpen. And you might do sharpen edges, or smart sharpen. But let's try this one, sharpen. And if we compare that, notice where her hair and her eyes are. You can see how it's giving you just a little bit more pop on that display. And that can really make a difference before you put that in a web page. So you have several blur features, blur, sharpen, and working with things like noise and despeckle, and you can use some of the tried and true methods or some of the newer features, for example, like that field blur or the iris or the tilt blur.